Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, and today we'll be doing a review. Except this review will be very special. Because, well, you see, 20 years ago, Pixar released a movie. And if you guessed it correctly, the movie Pixar released 20 years ago in 2006 was Cars. The movie did honestly really well, and then would spawn in a bunch of sequels and even a full-on franchise. And this is where we are 20 years later, where Cars has become a full-on franchise. And in honor to celebrate 20 years of Cars, I'm thinking about reviewing most of the main-ish characters, like mostly the Radiator Springs townies. But we're gonna start off with the protagonist, Lightning McQueen. You can see, here's my original Cars 1 McQueen. I actually first received them in 2013. In fact, I actually started collecting in 2011 when Cars 2 came out. I was like just 1 year old though, so honestly, yeah. But I still managed to grow up with a Cars 1 McQueen. You can see there's the front. You can see there's this usual expression, the Rusty's logo, the headlight stickers, because back then, say it with me now, race cars don't need headlights because the track is always lit. And back then he didn't have any headlights until he received them in Cars 2. Of course, one of the lightning bolt stickers right there. Now, of course, he is completely beat up, but that's because I had him since I was a kid. You can see there's the sides. You can see there's the secondary sponsors, the 95, the lightning bolt, and the Rusty's logo right there, and the gas cap. See the roof. There's the 95. Of course, the spoilers. There's the Rusty's texting. Of course, there's the wheels. There's the back. As you can see, there's the tail light stickers, the Rusty's logo, of course, his freaky stripe with medicated bumper ointment. You can see there's the other side, of course, the 95, the lightning bolts, Rusty's logo, secondary sponsors. Of course, there's the base. Then, so now let's move on to Mater. Then Mater is, of course, one of the main characters of Cars. In fact, he's the protagonist of Cars 2. And honestly, Mater's is probably the second recognizable Cars character out there with McQueen. Which honestly feels really nice. You can see there's my original Mater. You can tell he was actually, his rear view mirrors actually broke off, and I tried to make new ones to kind of replace it. But anyway, actually also have the Xyland release of a regular Mater alongside the long tow hook version. But anyway, we're just gonna stick with this one. There's his usual expression, of course, his exposed engine and his one headlight. There's the sides. You can see there's some blue rust around him. You can see there's some green rust around with Tomater Towing and Salvage, Radiator Springs, of course the blue rust around there. Of course, this was from when the back of him was plastic. Nowadays it's metal. Anyway, there's the wheels, in which the front ones are brown, with the back one being yellow right there. There's the back. You can see there's the towing assembly, the caution stripes, and of course, his infamous A113 license plate, which is a reference to a room at Pixar Animation Studios. There's the other side, of course, the blue rust, the green rust, Tomater Towing and Salvage, Radiator Springs, of course the wheels, the front one being brown and the back one being white. There's the base. And now let's move on to Doc Hudson. You can see Doc Hudson is actually based off of the real world Paul Newman, who also voiced him. Unfortunately, due to Paul Newman's death, Doc Hudson was killed off for the rest of the franchise. Which is really sad to think about. Anyway, there's his usual expression. Of course, the headlights are there. Of course, he's also very beat up because, like I said, I basically had him ever since I was a kid. Of course, I had gotten Doc in like 2014, I think. You can see there's the sun. You can see there's much going on. Of course, the running right there. Of course, there's his wheels, which as you can see, there's silver with white wool tires. There's the back. You can see there's much going on. You know, it's like clearly supposed to have detail right there, like the a detail like around the back. In fact, there was also the tail lights right there, but since they're chipped, it's kind of hard to tell. Of course, there's the other side. Of course, there's the base. And now let's move on to Sally Carrera, McQueen's love interest. You can see this is the original version of Sally. Later on in 2022, she would receive a variant that looked like this that would only be presented in a multi-pack. This would also appear for 2024 and 2025. So officially, as of 2026, this ended up being the current Sally you will see. And also I have Sally with tattoo right there. But we're just gonna stick with this Sally right here. You can see there's her usual expression. There's of course the Porsche logo right there. Of course the headlights, which are not detailed, and which they would be later on. Of course there's the side with nothing much going on. Of course there's the wheels. There's the back. You can see there's the taillights right there, which again are not detailed. They would be later on. Of course, the Carrera logo right there, since she is a Porsche 911 Carrera. Of course, her license plate, which reads 301 PCE. There's of course the other side. Of course there's the base. Then meanwhile the next cars will be moving on with Luigi and Guido. Then so Luigi and Guido are two characters that are always released together in the diecast line. In fact, they have been since 2006. They were first released in a 2-pack with a tractor, and Luigi and Guido were together there. And of course, when they would be released as singles, they would always be put in together. However, there are a lot of exceptions. There are many exceptions. For example, when Luigi was put in a 2-pack with Michael Schumacher, and there was only Luigi, there was no Guido. Of course, when Guido was put in a 2-pack with Sweet Tea from Cars 3, and it was only Guido, no Luigi. And of course, recently, from when Luigi would be put on in a 5-pack with Lightning McQueen, Mater, Doc Hudson, and Sally. And unfortunately, there was no Guido there. And even Guido being in a 2-pack with Red, with no Luigi whatsoever. But other than that, these two are always released together. Anyway, there's of course their usual expressions. Of course, Luigi was looking up. Of course, there's the sides. You can see there's not much going on. For Guido, he has a teal fender right there. Of course, the dark blue roof. You can see there's the back. And Luigi's license plate reads 445 108. You can see there's the other side. Of course, the wheels for Luigi, they're like white walls with silver rims. For Guido, they weren't detailed. There's the base. Then let's move on to Ramon. So Ramon has like a lot of paint jobs. Like he has like a lot. He had like a lot throughout the franchise. Like he actually has a lot throughout the first movie. In fact, so I decided to choose the purple one, the one with flames, because this one is honestly one of the most iconic Ramon paint jobs. You can see there's his usual expression. You can see the purple flames right there with some yellow lining. There's the sun. You can see there's some flames right there with yellow fading to orange, and also a purple shadowy flame. Of course, the rims right there. There's the back. You can see his tail lights right there, and of course his low and slow license plates. You can see there's the other side. Of course, his flames right there, and the rims. There's the base. And now let's move on to Flo. See, the interesting thing about Flo is that I actually never had a regular Flo since before 2020. Like the Flo I ended up having before was Pit Crew Member Flo, which was released in 2015. However, I think I got a 2-pack release with Hydraulic Lightning Ramon. At the same time, I got Transforming McQueen, So basically farther than 2016. And that ended up being my main flow. Until 2020, when I found a 2-pack with Nikki B and Flo. And that's how I ended up getting Flo. Which is really insane when you think about it. Like, the more you think about it, you could think that Flo is like one of my last edition from the Radiator Springs townies. But I'm glad to have her anyway. You can see there's her usual expression. Of course, there's the side. Of course, this lights color right there. And also that's followed with silver. There's of course the rims, which are white wool tires with silver. There's the back. You can see there's the tail lights. And of course, the low and slow, the showgirl license plate. You can see there's the other side. Of course, that decal right there. There's the base. And you can tell since it says made in Thailand. And now let's move on to Fillmore. So here's Fillmore. As you can see, there's this usual expression. Of course, this license plate right there with reading 51237. Of course, referencing the birthday to his original voice actor, George Carlin, who unfortunately passed away after the first Cars film came out. Now, as you can see, there's the sign. As you can see, there's a rainbow right there. Of course, this peace logo right there. Of course, Groovy Love. Of course, the wheels right there. There's the back. You can see there are so many stickers right there. So there's this license plate again. And of course, the infamous Save 2D animation sticker right there. Oh. Of course, there's the other side. Of course, the piece. And of course, the road right there is a flower with earth. Of course, in the roof, he has stars. Of course, there's the base. And now let's move on to Sarge. So here's Sarge, and you can see here's his expression, in which he mostly looks really angry. I mean, it mostly suits his character, I'm pretty sure. Of course, there's the hood right there, which has a star. Of course, the text thing right there, unfortunately it's faded, but that's because I had it before since I was a kid, but I'm not gonna read it this time. You can see there's the side. You can see there isn't much going on except for that badge right there, which is yellow. See, there's the back. You can see there's the first aid kit, and of course the back wheel right there. And of course, there's this license plate which reads 41WW2, which implies that Sarge fought in World War II in universe. You can see there's the other side. Of course, the badge right there, and of course the wheels. There's the base right then. So next car we'll be moving on with is Sheriff. The thing about Sheriff is, in the whole franchise, Sheriff has antennas right there and there and there around the back, and he also has curb feelers. But the thing is, they are not present in this diecast. Now for the curb peelers, I can understand why, but for the antennas, it feels a bit strange. In fact, the only Sheriff diecast to include the antennas is its Precision Series counterpart. But since that item is rare, I managed to make my own accurate version of Sheriff. You can see he's got the antennas right there. And I even gave him the curb peelers, but honestly, he still rolls. But let's just stick with this Sheriff. You can see there's his usual expression, and of course the grill, which, funnily enough, makes it look like a mustache, based on how it's detailed. And of course, there's his headlights. Of course, his headlights. Oh yeah. The roof lights right there. And of course, it's the siren. And of course, there's the side. As you can see, there's the badge right there. Or supposedly says Sheriff right there. Unfortunately, it's faded and also chipped because I had them before. Of course, there's the wheels, which are white walls, and the rims are silver. There's the back. As you can see, there's the Sheriff texting right there. Of course, his license plate supposedly reads 001. And of course, there's the tail lights right there and right there. There's the other side, as you can see. There's the badge right there. Of course, there's more chips. Or as you can see, there's the base. Now let's move on to Red. So, the history about Red is that originally when Red was first released in 2006, he was very small. Like, he was first released in a 2-pack with Stanley, and like I said, around that time he was very small. Luckily in 2011, to tie in with Cars 2, Mattel has decided to update Red by upscaling him to make him more accurate. But unfortunately though, recently Red has been downscaled again. Starting off with his recent rescue counterpart, and now with the main one in the 2-pack with Guido. We're just going to focus on the one that I have in my childhood. In fact, I don't even have the new Red just yet. You can see there's his usual happy expression. Of course, some silver detailing right there. Right there. Of course, the sides. You can see there's some decals right there with Raider Springs Fire Department. Of course, Raider Springs right there. It's mostly just the texting. Unfortunately, he doesn't have any yellow lining, which is seen on him in the actual franchise. You can see there's the ladder right there, and of course this little fire hose thing right there being attached to it. There's the back. You can see there's this license plate which reads 002. There's the Other side, of course, some Raider Springs Fire Department texting. Of course, the wheels, which the rims are red. There's the base. And now let's move on to Lizzie. And so here's Lizzie, and you can see there's her usual expression. You can see there's her headlights. There's the side. As you can see, there's nothing much going on aside from the wheels. There's the back. You can see there's a spare wheel right there, which has a tail light, and of course a license plate that reads MT23. Of course, I guess the MT is supposed to mean old Model T, which is what Lizzie is. Of course, the other side, let's see, there's nothing much to talk about. There's the base. And now, let's move on to Mac. You can see Mac is Lightning McQueen's transporter. In fact, he takes McQueen to races. You can see there's his usual expression. Of course, the Rusty's logo right there with some white background. Of course, there's his grill right there. Or with Mac texting right there. Of course, there's the side. You can see there's the 95 below the lightning bolt, which this placement is actually wrong because in the actual film, the lightning bolt is right next to the 95. I just thought to point that out. Also, his former rear view mirrors and exhaust pipes have broken off while I was a kid. So I thought I would make some new ones. And they're not that great, but at least I tried. And of course, on the trailer, there's the Rusty's logo, and of course, a picture of McQueen, Lightning McQueen, 95. Of course, there's the lightning bolt right there, and some secondary sponsors. You can see there's the back there on the trailer. There's Lightning McQueen, 95. The lightning bolt right there. Of course, another picture of the Queen. Of course, the Rusty's mud flaps on the actual cab. Of course, the license plate, which reads Rusty's 3. The same is, I think it's like supposedly true for the trailer. I'm not sure. There's of course the other side with of course the Queen, 95, another picture of the Queen and the Rusty's logo, and the roof for the trailer has the Rusty's logo right there. There's the base. Right then. So now let's move on to a tractor. So here's a tractor out of the actually no. Here's the tractor. You can see there's its usual expression. Of course, it's got spots like an actual cow, since in the actual movie tractors represented cows. Of course, the side, as you can see, it says Holstein Heifer Chewel. Of course, its engine right there, and of course the small wheels at the front, with the big ones in the back. There's the back with nothing much other than some spots. And of course the other side and the base. And something interesting is that it says somewhere, it says Thailand. I swear, like said it. Yeah, it says it right there. If the camera can focus, but yeah, meaning that this is a original 2006 release. I mean, this one I actually found on the flea market. In fact, I actually did have a tractor diecast back in my childhood, but unfortunately the wheel for this one broke. Of course, there's a tractor, another tractor toy I had from my childhood. It goes like this. And now let's move on to Frank. Now, here's Frank, and of course there's this eye expression. Of course, he also has a mouth expression, which is supposedly angry. It is because in the Cars, McQueen and Mater go tractor tipping. And Frank supposedly chases them away. As you can see, but moving on, there's also this roller right there, which is like supposedly a blade that like cuts grass. And you can see there's the side. You can see there's wheels right there. The front one being big and the back one being small. And there's the two vent coolers right there, and of course this movable pipe. There's the back with nothing much going on. Of course there's the other side. Again, nothing much going on. And of course he has some really nice detailing. Of course this is the original dirty variant, which weirdly, in 2020, Frank would receive a clean variant, which is honestly kind of weird. So there's the base, right then. So yeah, that is it for today, but we're not done yet, because we still have to go through the other main-ish characters. That, I mean, they're not really Radiator Springs townies, but they still had relevance to the plot. So we're going to be starting that off with Strip Withers, aka the King. So as you can see, the King is based on real-world NASCAR driver Richard Petty, who would also voice him in the film, which is honestly really cool. You can see there's his usual expression in which he's looking to the side. There's the Doneco logo right there, in which, fun fact, Doneco actually started off as a gas station in Toy Story. Later on for Cars, it would become the sponsor for the King. Of course, there's the side. You can see there's the sponsors, the 43, the Doneco logo right there, and of course the wheels. See, they say Lightyear. Of course, the rims are silver. There's the roof, which it was there. There's 43, and of course right there. On the trunk, I guess, there's the back. As you can see, there's the 43, and where the taillights would be. Of course, the Darnaco logo right there, and of course the silver bumper right there. There's the other side. You can see there's Darnaco logo right there, and the 43, the secondary sponsors. There's the base. And now let's move on to Chick Hicks, who is the main antagonist of the original film. You can see in Cars 1, Chick Hicks was voiced by Michael Keaton. However, for when Chick Hicks returned in Cars 3, he was recasted and instead voiced by Bob Peterson. I just thought to point that out. You can see there's his expression. Of course, this mischievous looking expression. Since again, he's the antagonist. Of course, the HTB, Hostile Takeover Bank logo right there with the yellow balloons. Of course, there's the side. As you can see, there's a lot of sponsors right there. Secondary sponsors. I mean, there's a lot. And if you want to, you can read them and we'll have it paused. But I wouldn't dare doing that. Of course, there's the 86, the HDB, Hostile Takeover Bank. There's the wheels, in which the rims are yellow. There's the roof with a lot of sponsors in the 86. Right there, this is HDB. There's the back, you can see. There it says HDB, Hostile Takeover Bank, in the 86. There's the other side with the HDB, Hostile Takeover Bank, in the 86. Of course, the wheels. There's the base. And one more thing to mention is that I actually added in a silver detailing around his grill stash right there. Of course, his grill looks like a mustache. I mean, it's not on the actual Chick Hicks diecast. I just thought I'd add it in to make it more accurate. And now let's move on with one of the delinquent road hazards, more commonly known as the tuners. Let's start with DJ. You can see here's DJ. Now, something interesting about DJ is that he was actually originally released with blue stripes, with these green stripe decals being gone from the hood, the spoiler, and it's basically it. However, Mattel will correct that in 2009, and DJ stayed like this ever since, alongside some future variants, until 2015, in which for whatever reason Mattel brought back the blue stripe DJ. However, luckily later on, Mattel cut to this and ended up re-releasing this DJ afterwards. But anyway, we're just gonna focus on this DJ. You can see there's his usual expression. Of course, the green stripes around him. There's the side. You can see there's more green stripes, and of course green stripes. There's this window right there, and of course some speakers there, and there's wheels, some green stripes around the spoiler. There's the back. You can see there's it's a whole speaker. I mean, there's a lot of speakers there with a whole this thing there, which he supposedly uses it to play music. And also there's taillights there, and also there's headlights there. There's the other side, as you can see. There's more green stripes, and also some speakers. There's the base. Then, let's move on to boost. Then, so here's boost. You can see there's this usual expression. Of course, this hood, which is black and has carbon detailing, which is really nice. In fact, the black parts around them have carbon detailing. Also really cool. Of course, there's the side with nothing much going on other than boost. Of course, there's black fenders and bottom. There's these wheels with originally, when it was first released in 2006, Boost had a red lining between the rims. However, later on in, was it around like 2008 or 2009, in which Boost would be corrected to have actual pink lining that he has in the film. Of course, there's these three cans right there, which are like supposedly into a cola. There's the back, not much going on other than the exhaust pipes, the tail lights, and of course this license plate, which just reads Boost. There's the other side, with of course nothing much other than Boost being right there. There's the base. Then, so now let's move on to Wingo. You can see there's Wingo. You can see there's this usual expression. Of course, in the front, he has this purple detailing. In fact, the front bumper is purple. You can see there's the side. You can see there's this texting right there. Of course, with decals in it. And there's the back. You can see there's nothing much going on other than tail lights and a license plate reading Wingo, in which Wingo is actually supposed to have decals around the back and also the spoiler. Unfortunately, that was not present in any merch that Mattel made for Wingo. It's not on this Mini Racer also. By the way, there's the other side with that texting right there as other decals. Of course, there's the base. You can see there's. Now we're gonna finish off with Snot Rod. You can see there's Snot Rod there. You can see if you can see his eyes right there. Of course, there's this engine right there. You can see there's of course this expression from around there. You can see there's the side with black lining with Snot Rod right there, and of course there's his wheels, in which the front ones are small with the big ones being, actually the back ones being big because he's a hot rod. There's the back. You can see nothing much going on in the taillights, the black lining, the SR, of course standing for Snot Rod, and of course his license plate reading Snot Rod. And which is license plate color would actually change later on, since this is a older release of him, in which it was formerly white, but would later on be changed to be purple. Of course, there's the other side. Of course, There's the black lining with the snot rod right there. And of course, with the exhaust pipes being there. And also there. There's the base. And so, yeah. So yeah, now that is it for today. And let me know what your thoughts on those die casts are. Or thoughts, or let me know your thoughts on the Cars franchise overall. And also let me know if you have any of these or all of these. Because it will be really cool to know. So yeah. Thank you so much for watching, and remember this. Happy 20th anniversary to Cars. And I'll see you next time. Bye.